Okie dokie. So, number one, not in any particular order, okay? Because none of these are dramatic scenarios that may be lying at the very foundations of our individual lives is more important than any other. Being a child of divorced parents, being a child of abusive parents, marrying into, that type of family with a family history that goes into those type of extreme behaviors. It's just something that happens. This has been part of our history as human beings, probably for as long as we can remember, since there has been power and powerlessness. What can you do? All you can do is acknowledge at some point your own situation. And I'm hoping that some of this material may, prove useful to anyone out there who runs into this, So I'm going to take off my glasses and read to you my first list, which will be a fairly short, I think 5 or 6 number of items, really, that came to my mind at first regarding actually sort of having distilled the experience from the outside, okay, observing someone who had lost a twin, a sibling in the womb at some point. And there's going to be, like I said in my introduction, quite a bit of overlap between these traits, and in the next 2 episodes that I'll be filming, there will be the same traits but expressed a bit differently. Okay, so here goes. I have called these traits, I have given them names. So the first trait that I'm going to point out to you is pseudo independence. In the case of a lost twin survivor, so a womb twin survivor, really, I would say that is a very thin veneer over the surface of a lot of their personal inner workings. They're described in the literature and the lists that are out there as very emotional and also really clingy people. So they tend to look for their twin always, and their life is structured by loss and sadness, often without them knowing that, without them realizing that. So there's a field, an emotion of sadness in their lives all the time that they themselves don't consider to be strange or remarkable in any way, because that's what they're used to. It's their normal atmosphere, their normal surroundings are like that. They're kind of weighed down. So the category or the idea of being pseudo-independent will be with respect to that sadness, with respect to that emotion. And whenever there is a potential in a lost twin survivor for a deeper relationship, they will work really hard also. They will always work really hard to achieve a level of connectedness and even of empathy with their partners or friends or whoever it may be, with a therapist even, it appears, that sort of undermines any independent tendencies in themselves. But of course, every person is different, and some of us have more independent natural streaks in their temperament than others, and some of us are the melting kind, so to speak. We want to merge with other people, and some of us don't. And often there's a line also going straight through the middle, with one half of us desiring connection and going all the way, all the miles, you know, also when there isn't really all that much coming from the other side. And so there's a lot of response back and forth, need, you know. And so the term pseudo independence will depend on who the person is, whether you are going to see this dichotomy in them or in yourself, potentially. The second term I'm going to use here is perpetuation. Because the sadness of the loss of their twin, their sibling, is such a dominant quality in their lives, there is a sense of perpetuation. That's what I've called that. A sense of their lives being the same always. And so there isn't really any possibility of growth, expansion, healing, or any of it. I have seen people referring to lost twin survivors as resisting healing also, and generally trying to force healing so that in fact nothing really happens or nothing changes. So there will be a measure of controllingness in that as well, which is a very common factor in all our behaviors. You don't have to be a twin survivor to be a control freak, you know, because witness me here. However, the theme of perpetuation, I thought it was worthwhile sort of lifting that out of this mass of data, because it will return in the other scenarios, and I think it is a way of acknowledging a certain level of hopelessness in all these three categories, in all these three types of lives that have to deal with trauma. There is this level of hurt, and it seems like there is no possibility for moving beyond the hurt ever. So that's an important one, okay? The third item, I am going to use the term lowness. However, I am restricting the low idea, the low down idea, to the self-image in particular. In the case of the lost twin survivor, there is potentially a possibility for devaluation. There may be a tendency to endlessly compare oneself to other people, which is also something everybody does, and to imagine endlessly other people's happiness or wholeness. But I am more leaning towards the sense that what I have seen with my husband is that it is almost impossible to make explicit, to communicate any real value in physical life to a lost twin survivor, because to them the dimension, the awareness of the soul has had such an impact on them at such an early age. Even you can't even speak of age. It may be an age of a few days even that this occurred to them, this happened to them. And compared to the world of the soul and the richness and the endless vibrancy and light of that world, you know, of course, being in a body is hard work. So what I've seen referred to in the lists on the internet and elsewhere is that they find it really hard to exist in their bodies. And the lost twin survivors have a really hard time connecting with their bodies, and that creates a whole different, you know, ball game of problems potentially. So even going as far as illness and pain and stuff like that. It says here in my other notes, not at home in their bodies. So that's really also a thing. This is like in sort of, as far as this perspective goes, it's more or less in the same corner as their devaluation, which isn't really the right word. You might also say the value of the world, of the life that we have in bodies in this world, just doesn't register for them as much as for people who are not. This is a really important distinction. This, how much value do you see in this, in any given moment of time, of your life, of your experience? How valuable is it? And I'm not talking about self-worth necessarily, although that sort of proceeds from this inner sense. There's a whole lengthy, endless network of themes here that has to do with this core sense of value or not. Okay, moving on. And it has all to do with each other. All those items, I'm enumerating them in the order that they occurred to me, but it's one really big network of items, of course, of tendencies and forces. What the next item I put down is codependent interaction. And he says here, to a certain level, maybe there's someone whose role it is to replace the lost twin. But they're mostly intensely lonely always, and nobody can ever affect that in the lost twin person. So that's what's being stressed, that they, in relationship, there's always this searching for this perfect partner. So that may be an idea here, and it may very well be that there's many more lost twin survivors out there than we have numbers for so far. It seems to be, generally, the consensus seems to be that there's about 10% of the human population who is in this situation. So by the time you have walked to the shop and back, you have met at least 2 or 3. That's just a short walk from here, okay? So the codependency thing is, of course, something that comes up a lot more. How I look at that is that you find yourself often in situations that are really, so to speak, counterproductive or counterintuitive or irrational in whatever way. Humans are really flexible, really resilient, and we put up with practically anything in order to stay in this pseudo comfortable context. It isn't really comfortable. So there's this constant hinging back and forth between wanting a better life for yourself and wanting the life with this partner, which is there apparently for a reason, maybe even. But the codependency is something that you can also really look up. It's useful to look at as a dimension, I've found, because at some point we have to decide also what it is that we are really willing to work with and what isn't. And this is where you get into the really tricky territory of defining somebody's behavior as somebody's or my own behavior as narcissistic, borderline, depressed, any of those really. I am not really afraid of the words. I am rather more afraid of that people will assume that I am talking about this one single thing. And I'm never talking about the one single thing. I'm always talking about at least the field of the thing, okay? So codependency is what it says. It means you're dependent. And a lot of us can be dependent on somebody where the other guy is also dependent on us, and it's okay, because nobody is really supposed to be completely free and autonomous all of the time. I think that's kind of impossible. So this is also where you get back to this pseudo-independence idea at the beginning, my number one idea. This idea of having a life of our own and being, there can be a lot of isolation, and we can try to compensate for the isolation by going all the way for this guy, which is a useful thing to think about. So my number 5 is also a low vibration type pronouncement, this is what I qualify as low emotion. And to a large extent, low emotion to me means feeling actually depressed, feeling like you have no future. So it isn't necessarily anxiety, or because in anxiety there will be often more of a sense of a fight. There will be more of a sense of resistance and wanting to make a statement for yourself and wanting to, make room for yourself. And there's the absence of that. So hence also the pseudo independence idea. And it's sometimes really hard to live with, to share your life with a lost twin survivor, because they're never, ever happy. Ever. And that's insane. There can be so many types and kinds of bits of happiness that can be found in this life. Sorry guys, there's a hair that's just straggling around apparently. That you can find good food, entertainment, cartoons, you name it. The sun is shining, cat is purring. When there's no access of that kind, I would certainly start to worry. So these are my 5 points so far as to lost twin. Let me also remind all of us that this is only a first attempt at defining these types of characteristics in this way, okay? So I'm going to stop here and move on to number 2, which will be about the second generation war victims survivors. So more to be done. Okay, see you there. Bye-bye.